The morning light filtered through the Venetian blinds in Rebecca's cramped studio apartment, casting harsh lines across the worn carpet where legal documents lay scattered like fallen leaves. 12 years had passed since she walked away from the only world she had ever known, 12 years since the Judicial Committee had announced her disfellowshipping to a congregation that included her parents, siblings, and every person who had once claimed to love her unconditionally. The irony wasn't lost on her now, staring at the inheritance documents that made it official her father had written her out of his will entirely, leaving everything to her younger brother Marcus, who remained a faithful witness in good standing. She picked up her phone with trembling fingers, the number still memorized after all these years of silence. Her mother answered on the third ring, that familiar voice now cold and mechanical, stripped of the warmth Rebecca remembered from childhood bedtime stories and scraped-knee comfort sessions. The conversation was brief, predictable, devastating. Her father had been dead for 3 weeks. The funeral had happened without her knowledge. The will reading had excluded her entirely. Marcus would inherit the family home, the business, everything their father had spent 40 years building. The gaslighting began immediately, as Rebecca had learned to expect. Her mother's voice took on that particular tone she recognized from countless Judicial Committee meetings, that measured cadence designed to make the victim question their own reality. Rebecca wasn't being punished, her mother explained patiently. This was simply the natural consequence of her choice to abandon Jehovah's organization. Her father had been protecting the family's spiritual heritage, ensuring that his life's work would remain in faithful hands. Rebecca's decision to leave had hurt him deeply, her mother continued, and he had died hoping she would return to the truth before it was too late. Rebecca felt the familiar rage building in her chest, that white-hot fury that had sustained her through the early years of shunning when the loneliness felt like it might actually kill her. She had been 19 when she first questioned the organization's doctrine on blood transfusions, 20 when she began researching the governing body's history of failed predictions and doctrinal reversals, 21 when she realized she could no longer live the lie that had consumed her entire family. The Judicial Committee had given her multiple chances to repent, to demonstrate that she was truly sorry for her rebellion against God's earthly organization. Instead, she had presented them with a carefully researched letter outlining her concerns about the two-witness rule, the organization's handling of child abuse cases, and the psychological manipulation inherent in their shunning practices. The months that followed had been a masterclass in institutional gaslighting. Former friends crossed the street to avoid making eye contact. Her own parents had stopped answering her calls, communicating only through her disfellowshipped aunt, who served as an unofficial intermediary for necessary family business. The congregation had been instructed not to greet her if they encountered her in public, not to acknowledge her existence in any meaningful way. The message was clear and brutal: she had chosen to leave God's people, and now she would experience life without divine protection or human love. Marcus had been the only family member to maintain any contact, meeting her secretly in coffee shops across town where they were unlikely to encounter other witnesses. He was 3 years younger, still living at home while he pioneered and served as a ministerial servant in the congregation. Their conversations were stilted affairs, Marcus clearly torn between his love for his sister and his terror of being discovered associating with a known apostate. He would update her on their parents' health, share sanitized versions of family news, and always end their meetings by encouraging her to consider returning to the organization. Those secret meetings had stopped 2 years ago when Marcus began dating a sister from a neighboring congregation, a young woman whose father served as an elder and whose family had a reputation for spiritual strength and organizational loyalty. Rebecca understood the position this put Marcus in. Association with a disfellowshipped family member could derail his engagement, damage his reputation, and limit his future opportunities for privileges within the congregation. The last time they met, he had been visibly agitated, checking his watch every few minutes and glancing nervously at other customers in the coffee shop. He loved her, he insisted, but he couldn't continue risking his spiritual standing by maintaining contact. Their father was getting older, he had explained. Someone needed to be there to take care of their parents as they aged, to ensure the family business continued to operate according to theocratic principles. That someone couldn't be Rebecca, not as long as she remained outside the organization. Now, holding the inheritance documents in her hands, Rebecca realized that Marcus had been preparing for this moment for years. The family business had been quietly transferred into his name 6 months before their father's death. The house had been deeded over to Marcus and his new wife just 3 months ago. Even the family's modest investment portfolio had been shifted into accounts bearing Marcus's name. Rebecca's father had been systematically erasing her from his financial life while she remained completely unaware, still harboring some small hope that family love might eventually transcend organizational loyalty. The double bind was perfect in its cruelty. To challenge the will, Rebecca would need to engage with a legal system that would require her to publicly air the family's religious practices and her reasons for leaving the organization. She would need to explain to secular attorneys and potentially a judge why being disfellowshipped constituted a form of religious discrimination that had influenced her father's testamentary decisions. She would need to detail the psychological manipulation, the systematic isolation, the way the organization had weaponized family relationships to punish those who dared to question its authority. But doing so would confirm everything her family believed about her apostate status. It would prove that she was willing to drag Jehovah's organization through the mud in worldly courts, exactly the kind of behavior that justified their decision to shun her in the first place. Rebecca thought about the evidence she had been collecting for years, not originally for any legal purpose but as part of her own healing process. She had documented every failed prediction from the Watchtower publications, every doctrinal reversal, every policy change that demonstrated the organization's fallibility. She had compiled testimonies from other former members about the psychological trauma of shunning, the family destruction caused by the organization's policies, the systematic suppression of dissent within the congregations. She had researched the governing body's financial holdings, their real estate investments, their tax-exempt status that allowed them to accumulate wealth while demanding financial sacrifice from rank-and-file members. Most significant of all, she had discovered something that would deeply embarrass her family if it ever became public: audio recordings and written notes from the judicial committees and elder meetings that had affected her life. Her father, who served as an elder for over 20 years, had kept detailed records of congregation matters and disciplinary meetings. What Rebecca had found in his old files would show the difference between the public face of loving shepherding and what really happened when the doors were closed. The recordings were the most painful discovery. Her father had recorded some judicial committee meetings over the years, including her own. Rebecca had listened to her judicial committee meeting again, hearing it with fresh perspective. She remembered every moment of that devastating 3-hour experience, but listening again revealed things she had been too emotional to notice at the time. After she left the room during her hearing, she could hear the elders discussing her case. They chuckled about some of her answers, made casual comments about her being overly dramatic and stubborn like her mother. They dismissed her carefully researched concerns about organizational issues without really examining them, with one elder joking that she was just another one who thinks she knows better than the faithful slave. They seemed more concerned about making an example for other potential questioners than genuinely caring about her spiritual well-being. The written records were equally disheartening. Her father had maintained files on congregation members, documenting their personal struggles and concerns in surprisingly casual and sometimes dismissive language. Rebecca found her own file, discovering that private conversations she had shared with her father about her doubts and questions had been written down and discussed with other elders. Her struggles with feeling disconnected during meetings, her questions about certain teachings, even her admission that she sometimes felt sad about disappointing everyone, all of it had been documented as evidence of spiritual weakness rather than normal human concerns. The notes revealed how elders viewed congregation members' personal problems more as administrative issues than individual human experiences. She read about elderly members being described as difficult for asking detailed questions during the Watchtower study, young people being labeled as watch list for typical teenage behavior like wanting to pursue higher education, and families being monitored because one member had expressed doubts about a particular teaching. Every person seemed to be reduced to their level of compliance and potential risk to congregation unity. What hurt most were the casual comments scattered throughout meeting notes and correspondence between elders. Rebecca found references to congregation members' personal struggles being discussed in an almost gossipy way, with elders expressing frustration about having to spend time counseling needy or emotional members. Her own name appeared multiple times with comments about her being spiritually immature and too influenced by outside thinking, assessments that seemed to come from annoyance rather than genuine concern for her welfare. The phone call to Marcus was more difficult than the one to their mother had been. Marcus had always been the sensitive one, the brother who had genuinely struggled with the organization's harsh stance toward former members. Rebecca could hear the tension in his voice when he answered, could picture him glancing around nervously to ensure his wife wasn't listening to their conversation. The news of her legal challenge to the will hit him like a physical blow. His voice cracked as he tried to explain why their father's decisions had been necessary, how the inheritance was really about protecting the family's spiritual legacy rather than punishing Rebecca for her choices. Rebecca let him finish his rehearsed explanation before she began to speak. Her voice was calm, measured, deadly in its precision. She told him about the recordings she had found, the audio files that captured how she had really been discussed by the elders during her judicial committee. She described the written records that showed how congregation members' personal struggles were documented and shared among the elder body, how her own private conversations with their father had been recorded and analyzed as signs of spiritual deficiency. She explained how she had discovered notes showing that elders regularly made light of members' concerns, joked about their emotional struggles, and viewed counseling as a burden rather than a privilege. She told him about files that revealed how questioning members were monitored and discussed among elders, how personal information shared in confidence was used to build cases against people who showed signs of independent thinking. Marcus tried to interrupt, to argue that she was misunderstanding the context or taking things out of proportion, but Rebecca pressed on steadily. She had her own judicial committee meeting on audio, she told him. Anyone could hear exactly how compassionate and caring the elders had been as they handled her concerns, how they had treated her emotional pain as something amusing rather than something deserving of empathy. She had recordings that showed the difference between the public presentation of elder meetings and what actually happened when congregation members weren't around to hear. The silence that followed was long and uncomfortable. Rebecca could hear Marcus breathing heavily on the other end of the line, could sense him processing information that challenged his assumptions about their father's service as an elder and the organization's actual treatment of struggling members. When he finally spoke, his voice had changed completely. Gone was the confident ministerial servant who had been prepared to defend organizational policies and family decisions. In his place was someone who sounded shaken and uncertain. Rebecca's demand was straightforward. She wanted her rightful share of the inheritance, not out of greed but as recognition that she deserved to be treated as an equal member of the family regardless of her religious choices. If Marcus was willing to work with her to modify the will's provisions, ensuring she received what should have been hers by right, then the sensitive materials she had discovered would remain private. The recordings and documents that showed the less flattering side of elder shepherding would stay securely stored in her apartment, irrelevant to any legal proceedings. However, if Marcus chose to uphold their father's discriminatory will, if he insisted that Rebecca's disfellowshipping justified cutting her out completely, then she would have no choice but to present her evidence in probate court. The recordings of judicial committee discussions would become part of the public record. The written files showing how congregation members were really viewed and treated would be available for examination by attorneys and potentially reporters. The gap between the organization's public image and private reality would be documented in court filings that could be accessed by anyone interested in the truth. Marcus asked for time, pleading for an opportunity to discuss the situation with their mother and seek guidance from the elders in his congregation. Rebecca granted him 72 hours, exactly the same amount of time a judicial committee typically allowed for someone to prepare their response to serious charges. The parallel was intentional and pointed. Just as the organization had demanded that she defend her spiritual worthiness before a tribunal that had already made its decision, she was now requiring Marcus to justify the family's choices before a secular authority that would apply different standards of fairness and evidence. The next 3 days crawled by with agonizing slowness. Rebecca found herself unable to concentrate on her work as a freelance graphic designer, unable to sleep through the nights that stretched endlessly in her small apartment. She had spent 12 years rebuilding her life outside the organization, creating new friendships with people who valued independent thinking, developing professional skills that had nothing to do with religious activities or organizational service. But the trauma of systematic family rejection had never fully healed, and the prospect of finally achieving some measure of justice felt both exciting and terrifying. She spent those 3 days reviewing more of the materials she had found, each new detail adding to her understanding of how the organization really functioned behind its carefully maintained public image. The recordings revealed patterns of dismissiveness toward members' concerns, casual attitudes toward people's emotional pain, and a focus on organizational control rather than individual spiritual welfare. The written records showed how personal struggles were treated as administrative problems and how questioning was viewed as a threat to be managed rather than a normal part of spiritual growth. Her phone rang exactly 71 hours after her ultimatum to Marcus. Her mother's voice was barely recognizable, stripped of its usual composed authority and replaced with something that sounded almost like fear. The conversation was brief and businesslike. Marcus had discussed the situation with several elders in his congregation and reviewed the potential consequences of a public legal battle. The family had concluded that discretion was more important than principle. They were prepared to negotiate a settlement that would provide Rebecca with a substantial portion of her inheritance, contingent on her agreement to sign confidentiality agreements that would prevent her from discussing the materials she had discovered or the family's internal disputes. Rebecca felt a complex mixture of victory and sadness as she listened to her mother's proposal. She would receive nearly half of what she would have inherited if her father's will had treated his children equally. The family business would remain under Marcus's control, but Rebecca would receive a cash settlement equivalent to a fair share of its assessed value. Most importantly, from her family's perspective, the negotiation process would remain completely private. No court filings would be necessary. No public documentation would exist of the discriminatory inheritance provisions or the evidence Rebecca had assembled to challenge them. The settlement meeting took place in a sterile conference room at the attorney's office Marcus had hired. Rebecca hadn't seen her mother in over 12 years, hadn't been in the same room with Marcus in over 2 years. The physical changes were striking and heartbreaking. Her mother looked much older than her actual age, her face marked by the stress of maintaining organizational loyalty while watching her family fall apart. Marcus appeared tired and defeated, his usual ministerial servant confidence replaced by the hollow-eyed expression of someone whose fundamental beliefs about righteousness and fairness had been badly shaken. Neither family member made direct eye contact with Rebecca during the formal proceedings. They spoke only to the attorneys, referring to her in third person as if she weren't present in the room. The legal documents were signed in silence, the financial arrangements finalized with clinical efficiency. Rebecca's settlement would be transferred within 30 days. The confidentiality agreements were comprehensive and mutual. None of them would ever speak publicly about the dispute or its resolution. As the meeting concluded, Rebecca made one final attempt at human connection. She told her mother that she still loved her, still hoped that someday they might be able to have a relationship that went beyond organizational policies. She told Marcus that she was proud of the man he had become, that she understood the impossible position the organization's rules had placed him in. She offered both of them her contact information, expressed her willingness to rebuild their relationship if they ever decided that family love was more important than religious conformity. Her mother stood and walked out of the conference room without acknowledging Rebecca's words. Marcus lingered for a moment, his eyes filling with tears as he looked at his sister for what he clearly believed might be the last time. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then seemed to remember the weight of organizational expectations and the presence of lawyers as witnesses. Instead, he simply nodded once and followed their mother out of the room. Rebecca drove home through city traffic that felt surreal after the intensity of the morning's proceedings. She had won a significant financial victory, had forced her family to acknowledge her rights despite their religious objections, had proven that the evidence she had assembled was powerful enough to compel negotiation rather than risk public exposure. But the victory felt hollow and bitter. She had not regained her family's love or acceptance. She had not changed their fundamental beliefs about organizational authority and family loyalty. She had simply used their fear of embarrassment to obtain what should have been freely given based on family bonds. That evening, Rebecca sat in her apartment surrounded by the recordings and documents she had promised to keep confidential. 12 years of research into organizational problems, elder attitudes, and family manipulation would remain locked away in encrypted files and password-protected folders. The truth she had threatened to reveal would stay hidden, not because it was false or unimportant but because exposing it would have costs that extended far beyond her personal disagreements with her family. She thought about the other former witnesses she had met over the years, people who were struggling with similar family rejection and religious discrimination. Many of them lacked the resources to challenge unfair inheritance decisions, lacked the documentation to prove that religious differences had influenced their treatment by family members who remained in the organization. Her settlement had been possible only because her father's record-keeping habits had provided leverage that most former members would never possess. The confidentiality agreement prevented her from sharing the specific recordings and documents she had gathered about her father's activities as an elder, but it didn't prevent her from continuing her research into the organization's broader patterns of member treatment and family policies. Rebecca realized that her inheritance settlement had given her something more valuable than money. It had provided her with the financial stability to dedicate herself to documenting and addressing the issues that the organization used to maintain control over its members and their families. Over the following months, Rebecca threw herself into advocacy work with the intensity she had once reserved for pioneer service. She collaborated with journalists who were researching the organization's policies, provided background information to attorneys who were representing former members in family disputes, contributed to academic studies of high-control religious groups and their impact on relationships. She could never publicly discuss her own family-specific case, but she could help ensure that other families' stories were told with the context and validation they needed to be understood and believed. The work was emotionally challenging but psychologically healing. Every former member who gained recognition of unfair treatment, every journalist who published articles about organizational policies and their effects, every academic paper that documented the real-world impact of religious shunning represented a small victory against the forces that had damaged her own family relationships. Rebecca couldn't repair her relationship with her parents or change Marcus's situation, but she could help prevent other families from experiencing the same betrayal and abandonment. 2 years after the settlement, Rebecca received an unexpected phone call from Marcus. His voice was barely recognizable, broken and desperate in a way that reminded her of her own emotional state during the early years after her disfellowshipping. He had been discovered by the elders meeting privately with a former member who had been his childhood friend, someone who had been disfellowshipped for questioning the organization's stance on higher education. The Judicial Committee had demanded that Marcus choose between his privileges in the congregation and his friendship with a former member. When he had attempted to explain that the friendship was helping him understand how to better support others who were struggling with doubts, the elders had accused him of being influenced by questionable thinking himself. Marcus was facing his own Judicial Committee hearing, his own potential disfellowshipping, his own experience of organizational judgment and family pressure. His wife had already begun distancing herself from him, fearful that association with a spiritually questionable husband might damage her own standing in the congregation. Their mother had stopped speaking to him entirely, unwilling to risk being associated with another potential problem. Marcus was discovering what Rebecca had learned 12 years earlier, that organizational love was conditional, manipulative, and ultimately hollow. The conversation that followed was unlike any they had shared since childhood. Marcus apologized for his role in Rebecca's exclusion from their father's inheritance, acknowledged that the settlement had been an act of justice rather than greed, admitted that he was beginning to understand the courage it had taken for her to walk away from everything she had known. He asked careful questions about her life outside the organization, about how she had managed to rebuild her identity and relationships without the framework that had defined their entire family structure. Rebecca found herself in the strange position of providing emotional support to the brother who had participated in her systematic exclusion from family life. But she recognized the psychological pressure that had made Marcus a victim even as it had made him complicit in her treatment. The organization's control mechanisms were designed to turn family members against each other, to make love conditional on organizational loyalty, to ensure that leaving the group meant losing everything and everyone that had ever mattered. Their conversation lasted for hours, stretching deep into the night as Marcus wrestled with questions that Rebecca had been researching and thinking about for over a decade. She shared resources with him, books and websites and support groups that had helped her understand the dynamics of high-control religious groups. She explained how emotional manipulation and fear-based control made it difficult for members to recognize problems even when they were experiencing them directly. Most importantly, she assured him that it was possible to build a meaningful life outside the organization, that the warnings about spiritual destruction and worldly corruption were tools of control rather than genuine prophecies. Marcus's judicial committee hearing resulted in his disfellowshipping, a decision that Rebecca learned about through a mutual acquaintance who had attended the announcement at the Kingdom Hall. Marcus's wife had filed for divorce within a week of his removal from the organization, taking their young daughter and moving back to her parents' house in another state. Their mother had changed her phone number and blocked all attempts at communication. Marcus found himself experiencing the same systematic isolation and family destruction that Rebecca had endured, the same emotional pressure designed to force him back into organizational compliance. But Marcus also discovered what Rebecca had learned, that life outside the organization, while initially terrifying and lonely, offered opportunities for authentic relationships and personal growth that had been impossible within the confines of organizational control. He began therapy to address the religious trauma that had shaped his entire worldview, started building friendships with people who valued him as an individual rather than as a representative of religious orthodoxy, slowly developed the critical thinking skills that the organization had systematically discouraged throughout his childhood and young adult years. Rebecca and Marcus's relationship became a source of healing for both of them, a demonstration that family bonds could survive and even strengthen when they were freed from organizational manipulation. They never spoke publicly about their parents' continued shunning or their father's discriminatory will, honoring the confidentiality agreements that had made Rebecca's inheritance settlement possible. But they found ways to support other former members who were dealing with similar family destruction, sharing their experience and resources while respecting the legal constraints that governed their own situation. Years passed. Rebecca's research and advocacy work gained recognition in academic and legal circles that were studying high-control religious groups and their impact on family relationships. Marcus completed his undergraduate degree in psychology and began graduate studies in trauma counseling, specializing in religious recovery issues. Both of them built lives that were rich and meaningful in ways that would have been impossible if they had remained within the organization that had once defined their entire existence. Their mother died alone in a nursing home, having refused contact with both of her children for over 15 years. The funeral was a small affair attended only by congregation members who had known her as a faithful sister rather than as a woman who had sacrificed her relationship with her children to maintain her standing in a religious organization. Rebecca and Marcus learned of her death through an obituary that made no mention of their existence, a final act of erasure that both of them had long expected but that still carried emotional weight. The inheritance from their mother's estate was modest but symbolically significant. This time, there was no discrimination based on religious status. Both children received equal shares of her belongings and savings, perhaps because there had been no organizational pressure to exclude them or perhaps because their mother's final attorney had insisted on legal equality regardless of religious considerations. Rebecca donated her portion to organizations that supported former members of high-control religious groups, completing a circle of justice that had begun with her threat to reveal the truth about her father's attitudes toward congregation members. Looking back on the decades that had passed since her first challenge to organizational authority, Rebecca recognized that the inheritance dispute had been about much more than money or property. It had been about the right to exist outside organizational control, about the validity of choosing individual conscience over group conformity, about the possibility of maintaining family relationships despite religious differences. Her threat to reveal embarrassing truths had been successful not because the information itself was so damaging, but because it represented a fundamental challenge to the fiction that the organization's policies were based on divine love rather than human manipulation and control. The story continued to unfold in courtrooms and therapy offices, in support groups and academic conferences, in the quiet conversations between family members who were slowly learning to love each other without the mediation of religious authority. Rebecca's victory in securing her inheritance had been just one battle in a much larger war for psychological freedom and authentic relationships. The truth she had threatened to reveal was bigger than any single family's financial arrangements or religious practices. It was the truth about systematic manipulation, psychological pressure, and the human cost of organizational control over individual lives and family relationships. 3 years after Marcus's disfellowshipping, Rebecca received a package in the mail with no return address. Inside were dozens of documents she recognized immediately, more recordings from their father's elder files, additional written records about congregation matters, notes from circuit overseer visits. Marcus had somehow obtained copies of additional materials their father had kept, evidence that showed how widespread these attitudes were beyond just their local congregation. The accompanying letter was written in Marcus's careful handwriting. He explained that their father had kept these additional materials in a safety deposit box that Marcus had discovered while settling the final details of the estate. The contents had surprised him even more than Rebecca's original discoveries had. Their father hadn't just documented the casual attitudes within his own congregation, he had been part of a network of elders who regularly discussed difficult members and shared approaches for dealing with questioning individuals across multiple congregations. Marcus had spent months wrestling with what to do with the information. The confidentiality agreement prevented him from sharing it with Rebecca directly, but nothing prevented him from anonymously providing her with materials that she might find useful. He hoped she would understand and act accordingly. If she chose to use the evidence to help other people who had similar experiences, he would support her decision completely. Rebecca spent weeks studying the new materials, cross-referencing them with stories she had collected from other former witnesses. The pattern that emerged was concerning but not entirely surprising. Her father had been part of a culture where elders regularly dismissed members' genuine concerns, where personal struggles shared in confidence became topics of casual discussion among the elder body, and where anyone who asked too many questions was viewed as a potential problem for congregation peace. The evidence showed how elders communicated with each other about members they considered difficult or spiritually weak. Rebecca found detailed discussions about families going through hard times, with elders expressing frustration about having to provide ongoing support and counsel. She discovered notes about how to handle members who asked challenging questions, with approaches focused more on maintaining authority than addressing the actual concerns raised. Several former members had attempted to address these issues through the organization's internal complaint processes, but they had been consistently dismissed or told they were being overly sensitive. Rebecca found documentation showing how concerns about elder conduct were handled, usually by the same elders being questioned, with predictable results. The pattern showed a system more focused on protecting leadership than addressing legitimate grievances from congregation members. Rebecca realized that her family's situation was part of a much larger pattern of how the organization handled questioning members and their families. Her own exclusion from the inheritance was just one example of how religious loyalty was prioritized over family relationships, how institutional conformity was valued more than individual conscience or family bonds. She began reaching out carefully to other former witnesses who might have had similar experiences with dismissive treatment from elders or family discrimination based on religious status. The stories she collected revealed a consistent pattern: elders who treated genuine concerns as spiritual weakness, families who felt pressured to choose organizational loyalty over relationships with questioning relatives, and individuals who had been made to feel that their doubts and struggles were personal failures rather than legitimate responses to organizational problems. The research became Rebecca's focus for the next 2 years. She worked with journalists interested in religious freedom issues, collaborated with attorneys representing other former members in family disputes, and contributed to academic studies about high-control religious groups. The work was emotionally challenging but also healing, as each story she documented helped validate her own experience and demonstrated that she wasn't alone in what she had endured. Marcus provided ongoing support, carefully sharing additional information while being discreet about his involvement. He had kept copies of many documents from their father's files, including materials that showed how elders in different congregations dealt with similar situations. The evidence suggested an organizational culture that consistently prioritized institutional authority over individual welfare, even when it meant causing significant emotional harm to faithful members who simply had questions or concerns. The breakthrough in Rebecca's research came when she identified patterns in how elder bodies handled problem members across multiple congregations. The approach was remarkably consistent: dismiss concerns without proper consideration, label questioners as spiritually weak, and gradually reduce their involvement until they either submitted completely or left the organization. The documentation showed that this wasn't accidental but was the result of training and policies that emphasized control over compassion. Rebecca documented dozens of cases where former witnesses had experienced similar treatment, having their concerns dismissed, being labeled as problems for asking questions, facing family pressure to choose between relationships and religious conformity, and ultimately being excluded from family inheritance or support when they chose to leave. The pattern was so consistent that it clearly reflected organizational policy rather than individual elder decisions. The documentation was detailed enough to support Rebecca's work in helping other former members understand their experiences, but she faced the same dilemma that had complicated her inheritance dispute. Making this information public might help validate other people's experiences, but it could also cause additional pain for families who were still trying to maintain relationships across religious boundaries. Many people were still hoping for eventual reconciliation with family members who remained in the organization. Rebecca chose a thoughtful approach. Working with counselors who specialized in religious recovery and attorneys experienced in family law, she compiled the evidence into resources that documented common patterns of experience without identifying specific individuals or congregations. The materials were shared with support organizations for former members, academic researchers studying high-control religious groups, and legal professionals who were helping people navigate similar family disputes. The work that followed was conducted carefully and ethically, focusing on helping people understand their experiences rather than attacking the organization or its members. Rebecca's documentation provided validation for former members who had been told they were too sensitive or had misunderstood their treatment. It helped therapists understand the specific challenges faced by people leaving high-control religious environments. It assisted attorneys in recognizing patterns of family discrimination that might have legal remedies. Marcus was never publicly identified as a source, but his cooperation had been essential for understanding how widespread these attitudes and practices were. The outcome validated both siblings' choice to prioritize truth and justice over organizational loyalty, while still respecting the genuine faith and good intentions of family members who remained active in the organization. The success of Rebecca's advocacy work created opportunities for her to help other people navigate similar situations. She was invited to speak at conferences about religious recovery, consulted on legal cases involving family disputes related to religious differences, and contributed to discussions about protecting individuals' rights while respecting religious freedom. The financial security from her inheritance settlement allowed her to dedicate herself to this work full-time. Marcus completed his psychology degree and established a counseling practice that specialized in helping people recover from religious pressure. His work focused on helping former members understand the psychological mechanisms they had experienced, rebuild their sense of self-worth, and develop healthy relationships with family members when possible. His research contributed to better understanding of the long-term effects of growing up in high-control religious environments. Brother and sister collaborated on several projects that combined Rebecca's research skills with Marcus's clinical expertise. They co-authored articles about the psychological impact of religious family pressure, contributed to treatment approaches for survivors of organizational control, and developed educational materials that helped former members recognize and address the emotional symptoms that often persisted for years after leaving high-control religious groups. Their work was informed by their personal experience but grounded in rigorous research and professional standards that gave it credibility in academic and clinical settings. The precedents established by Rebecca's inheritance case inspired similar efforts across the country. She served as a consultant for attorneys who were representing people in religious family disputes, helping them understand the psychological dynamics that made discrimination possible and the evidence standards necessary to prove unfair treatment. Each successful case expanded the legal framework that protected religious minorities while preserving the constitutional rights of legitimate religious organizations. Years passed. Rebecca and Marcus both built professional reputations that were respected in their respective fields, contributed to social changes that made it more difficult for high-control religious groups to pressure their members, and maintained a relationship that demonstrated the possibility of family healing after organizational manipulation. They never spoke publicly about their parents' specific choices or their own family's internal conflicts, honoring the confidentiality agreements that had made Rebecca's inheritance settlement possible while working to prevent similar harm to other families. The organization that had shaped their childhood continued to evolve in response to legal and social pressures, implementing policy changes that addressed some of the issues that Rebecca and Marcus had documented. The governing body issued new guidelines about elder conduct and disciplinary procedures, established better oversight for judicial committees, and created reporting procedures that made it more difficult for local leaders to dismiss legitimate concerns. These changes didn't acknowledge wrongdoing or apologize to those who had been harmed, but they represented concrete improvements that reduced the likelihood of future problems. Rebecca received occasional updates about organizational changes through her network of contacts within the former witness community. The reports painted a picture of an institution that was slowly being forced to confront the consequences of decades of authoritarian control and family manipulation. Legal challenges, media attention, and internal pressure from reform-minded members were creating cracks in the rigid structure that had once seemed unshakable. The truth that Rebecca had threatened to reveal about her father's attitudes as an elder was part of a larger truth about organizational accountability that was slowly becoming impossible to ignore. When news of their mother's declining health reached Rebecca and Marcus through mutual acquaintances, they made the difficult decision to attempt contact despite the emotional risks involved. Their mother was in the final stages of cancer, alone in a nursing home where congregation members visited occasionally but family was prohibited by organizational policy. The conversation that followed was brief and heartbreaking, conducted through a social worker who served as an intermediary because their mother was still too committed to organizational loyalty to speak directly with her disfellowshipped children. Their mother's final message was delivered through the social worker with clinical precision. She still loved her children, she wanted them to know, but she could not compromise her relationship with Jehovah by associating with them directly. She hoped they would return to the truth before it was too late, hoped they would be reunited in the resurrection when family relationships would be restored under perfect conditions. She forgave them for the pain their choices had caused the family, but she could not change her position as long as they remained outside the organization. Rebecca and Marcus realized that their mother would die as she had lived for the past 15 years, trapped by psychological conditioning that made it impossible for her to choose family love over institutional loyalty. Her death represented the final casualty of a system that claimed to strengthen families while systematically destroying them, that promised eternal life while demanding the sacrifice of authentic human relationships. The tragedy wasn't just personal but structural, the inevitable result of teaching that prioritized organizational authority over individual conscience and family bonds. The inheritance from their mother's modest estate was processed without controversy this time, divided equally between her two children according to standard legal procedures that made no reference to religious status or organizational standing. Rebecca donated her portion to organizations that provided support services for former members of high-control religious groups, completing a circle of justice that had begun with her threat to reveal the truth about organizational attitudes and family destruction within the system that had once defined her entire world. The final settlement of their parents' estate marked the end of one phase of Rebecca and Marcus's recovery from organizational control, but it also represented the beginning of a new chapter in their ongoing work to help other families avoid similar destruction. They had learned that healing from religious pressure required more than individual therapy or personal growth. It demanded systematic change in the institutional structures that made manipulation possible and the social attitudes that allowed it to continue without accountability. Their story became part of a larger narrative about religious freedom, family rights, and the ongoing struggle to balance constitutional protections for religious organizations with legal safeguards for vulnerable individuals who might be harmed by institutional policies. Rebecca's threat to reveal embarrassing truths about her father's activities as an elder had evolved into a comprehensive documentation project that exposed common patterns and led to meaningful support for other families. The truth she had discovered was bigger than any single family's experience, more significant than any individual case of inheritance discrimination or religious pressure. 20 years after her disfellowshipping, Rebecca stood before a congressional subcommittee that was examining the family law implications of religious shunning practices and organizational pressure on former members. She testified about the patterns of dismissive treatment she had uncovered, the family destruction caused by discriminatory policies, and the need for legal changes that would provide better protection for individuals who chose to leave high-control religious groups. Her testimony was informed by decades of research, validated by extensive documentation, and strengthened by the support systems that her work had helped establish. Marcus watched from the gallery as his sister presented evidence that represented the culmination of their shared journey from organizational pressure to respected advocacy for religious recovery. The truth she was revealing to federal lawmakers was the same truth she had threatened to reveal to their family 2 decades earlier, that systematic problems were not accidents but features of organizational structures that prioritized institutional loyalty over individual welfare, that religious authority could be misused against vulnerable populations, and that constitutional protections for religious freedom needed to be balanced with legal safeguards for those who might be harmed by religious practices. The congressional hearing represented just one moment in an ongoing national conversation about religious accountability, family rights, and the proper scope of institutional authority in democratic societies. Rebecca's testimony contributed to legislative proposals that would require religious organizations to implement better oversight for disciplinary procedures, provide protection for former members from family discrimination, and ensure that people had access to legal remedies regardless of their organization's restrictions on litigation. The work continued in courtrooms and legislatures, in academic conferences and therapeutic settings, in the quiet conversations between family members who were learning to build authentic relationships without the pressure of religious authority. Rebecca and Marcus had transformed their personal experience into social advocacy, their family's destruction into a platform for protecting other families from similar harm. The truth they had revealed had grown from a private inheritance dispute into a public examination of how religious institutions could be held accountable for the harm they caused while preserving the constitutional freedoms that protected legitimate religious practice. Their parents were gone, their childhood faith was irretrievably lost, and their family relationships had been permanently altered by organizational policies that prioritized institutional loyalty over human love. But from that destruction had emerged something valuable and enduring. A commitment to truth that transcended religious authority, a dedication to justice that did not depend on divine validation, and a demonstration that authentic family relationships could survive and even strengthen when they were freed from the manipulation of high-control religious organizations. The story of Rebecca's inheritance dispute would be forgotten by most people who heard it, absorbed into the larger historical record of religious conflict and family pressure that marked the early 21st century. But the legal precedents it established, the policy changes it inspired, and the therapeutic innovations it contributed to would continue to protect vulnerable individuals for generations to come. The truth Rebecca had threatened to reveal had become part of the larger truth about human dignity, family rights, and the ongoing struggle to balance religious freedom with individual protection in pluralistic democratic societies. In the months following her congressional testimony, Rebecca received hundreds of letters from former members of various high-control religious groups who had experienced similar family destruction and religious discrimination. Each letter told a variation of the same story: children cut off from inheritances because they had chosen individual conscience over group conformity, parents who had died alone because organizational policies prohibited contact with former members, siblings torn apart by religious authority that demanded absolute loyalty to institutional teachings rather than human relationships. The correspondence revealed the scope of a problem that extended far beyond her own family's experience or even the specific policies of her childhood organization. Across denominational lines, authoritarian religious groups were using similar tactics to maintain control over their members: shunning policies that weaponized family relationships, disciplinary procedures that dismissed and discouraged questioning members, pressure campaigns that made it difficult for individuals to maintain relationships after leaving the organization. Rebecca began organizing these testimonies into a comprehensive database that documented patterns of experience across different religious contexts. Working with Marcus and a growing network of specialists, attorneys, and former members from various groups, she developed resources that helped survivors understand the common psychological mechanisms underlying religious control regardless of specific doctrinal differences between organizations. The project revealed that the techniques used to discourage questioning and suppress independent thinking were remarkably consistent across groups that claimed to have nothing in common except their dedication to truth and spiritual purity. The database became a valuable resource for researchers, legal professionals, and mental health practitioners who were working to understand and address the long-term effects of religious control. It provided evidence for policymakers who were considering legislative changes to protect vulnerable individuals from institutional manipulation, documented patterns that helped attorneys build stronger cases for clients who were seeking legal remedies for religious discrimination, and offered validation for survivors who had been told that their experiences were unique problems rather than predictable consequences of systematic control. Marcus's clinical practice expanded as referrals increased from attorneys, other therapists, and former members who had learned about his specialized approach to religious recovery. His research on the psychological effects of organizational shunning and family pressure contributed to diagnostic criteria that helped mental health professionals recognize and treat the specific symptoms associated with leaving high-control religious groups. His therapeutic approaches were adopted by treatment centers across the country, providing evidence-based interventions that address the unique challenges faced by individuals recovering from systematic spiritual control. The siblings' collaborative work gained international attention as religious freedom organizations, human rights advocates, and academic researchers recognized the broader implications of their findings. They were invited to speak at conferences in Europe, Australia, and Canada where similar issues were being debated in legislative and judicial contexts. Their research contributed to policy discussions at the United Nations about protecting individuals from religious coercion while preserving legitimate religious freedom for voluntary participants in faith communities. Rebecca's inheritance case became a teaching tool in law schools where students studied the complex intersection of religious freedom, family rights, and civil litigation. The confidentiality agreement that had sealed the specific details of her family's financial arrangements didn't prevent her from discussing the general legal principles and strategies that had made her settlement possible. Her case study helped future attorneys understand how to represent clients who were challenging discriminatory treatment based on religious status while navigating the constitutional protections that religious organizations enjoyed under law. The ripple effects of their work continued to expand over the years, touching families and individuals who would never know the specific origins of the legal protections and therapeutic resources that had helped them recover from organizational pressure. Each successful court case that cited precedents established by Rebecca's inheritance dispute, each therapy session that used treatment approaches developed from Marcus's research, each policy change that made it more difficult for religious organizations to pressure their former members represented a continuation of the truth-telling that had begun with a simple threat to reveal evidence of dismissive attitudes and family manipulation. As Rebecca approached her 50th birthday, she reflected on the journey that had transformed her from a disfellowshipped young woman facing systematic family rejection into a respected advocate whose work had helped protect thousands of vulnerable individuals from similar treatment. The inheritance money that had begun this process had been spent and donated years earlier, but the legal precedents, therapeutic innovations, and policy changes it had helped create would continue to benefit survivors for decades to come. Her threat to reveal embarrassing truths had evolved into a life's work dedicated to ensuring that other families wouldn't have to choose between religious conformity and authentic human relationships, that other individuals wouldn't have to sacrifice their emotional well-being to maintain their spiritual integrity, and that other children wouldn't grow up believing that love was conditional on organizational approval. The truth Rebecca had threatened to reveal 25 years earlier had grown into something much larger than a single family story of religious discrimination and inheritance dispute. It had become part of a broader movement toward accountability, transparency, and justice that was slowly transforming how religious organizations operated in democratic societies. The recordings of judicial committee discussions that she had discovered in her father's files were just one small piece of a much larger puzzle that revealed how institutional authority could be misused, how vulnerable individuals could be manipulated and controlled, and how the promise of spiritual salvation could be used to justify psychological pressure and family destruction. The legacy of Rebecca's threat to reveal the truth continued to unfold in ways that neither she nor Marcus could have anticipated when they first began their journey toward healing and justice. Their story had become part of the historical record, a testament to the power of individual courage to challenge institutional authority, the importance of family relationships that transcended religious boundaries, and the ongoing struggle to balance religious freedom with human dignity in pluralistic societies that valued both spiritual expression and individual rights. The simple threat to reveal some embarrassing recordings and documents had transformed into a comprehensive movement that would protect vulnerable individuals and families for generations to come.